Hey guys, I just finished setting up a new terrarium for some amazing toads with supplies I purchased from New England Herpeticulture. NE Herp is the sponsor of today's episode of the Frog Rack Podcast. They have been my first choice for terrarium supplies since they opened their doors in 2009. I keep shopping with NE Herp because Mike and Jessica are hobbyists first. They continue to have first-hand experience building vivariums and providing excellent care for captive herps. They have the best customer service, fast shipping, and a wide selection. I can always find the herp supplies I need at neherpeticulture.com. If you keep reptiles or amphibians, and you are looking to build the perfect bioactive habitat, NE Herp is your go-to source for terrariums, lighting, live plants, substrates, microfauna, wood, decor, supplements, feeder insect culturing supplies, and more. Like I said, everything you need in one place. Trusted nationwide by hobbyists, dart frog enthusiasts, and zoos, and your favorite Frog Rack podcaster. NE Herp is your one-stop vivarium shop. So head on over to neherpeticulture.com and pick up the supplies you need to support your herp hobby. Thank you, NE Herp, for supporting today's episode of the Frog Rack Podcast. Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Frogcast, the Frog Rack Podcast. My name is Joe Mayotte. I've been going by Frog Rack on the interwebs for 2 decades. Joining me today to have a conversation during this first podcast is Matt Wayne from Not Another Reptile Podcast. How are you, Matt?
Oh, very good, man. Thank you so much for having me on. I couldn't be more stoked to see that you're going down the podcasting journey, because I'm sure people have heard you on my show, and I've gotten nothing but awesome feedback. Everybody loved it. So it's exciting that we got another awesome podcaster joining the ranks of the Herp podcast community.
Thanks. It seems to be a trendy thing to do these days. Tell me a little bit about when you started Not Another Reptile Podcast and why you started it.
Yeah, so my show, it's been a journey. So I attempted a podcast called Amphibious, an amphibian-centric podcast back during COVID. But once COVID restrictions kind of got lifted, that show just never went anywhere. So fast forward from 2020 to 2024, my life went nutso, to say the least. Like I'm on my show, I'm really open about it, but I'm in recovery. Like I had a huge drinking problem, full-blown alcoholic. So as I embraced, first I accepted the fact that I had a drinking problem. Then I go get help. I go into recovery. I was very afraid to relapse. Obviously, most addicts who have gotten past, that initial 30, 60, 90 days, that fear kind of sets in. So I was basically embracing the reptile community, the herp community, the amphibian community as much as I could. The bad part about doing that, though, is a lot of the amphibians that we keep are not hands-on. So it got very, very... I think I was being detrimental, being so involved with updating enclosures and tweaking stuff. I was just constantly messing with them. So, I'm sitting there, and I feel like I'm stressing out I keep a lot of Frie Salamanders, and I felt like I was stressing them out. So I was like, what else can I do? That I read a lot, but reading to me isn't I don't know, it's like a passive thing. And I'm like, I want to do something more. And I wanted to kind of give back to the community that's given me so much. So I'm like, well, I love to talk. I don't ever shut up. So naturally, it kind of felt like, hey, maybe I'll try this podcasting thing again. And I started out, and I was very apprehensive about opening up about my struggles with sobriety and stuff. And I remember when I did my first show, was a solo one, I was very I didn't want to talk about it. And then I interviewed Anthony from Gecko Exchange podcast. Yeah. And I didn't bring it up, but then I interviewed Jason, and I kind of just started talking about it, and I didn't know how that would make me feel. I was, when you go through sobriety, a big cause for me of my drinking was to suppress emotions. So I didn't know how I was going to feel about talking about it, but it actually felt extremely therapeutic. And I started getting a lot of feedback from people saying dude, that's crazy. I struggle too. I'm 3 years sober. I'm 10 years or whatever. And I realized even though it's my story, it might also be beneficial to the community in general to kind of know that, like, hey, there's this other guy out here who loves reptiles, loves salamanders just as much as the next person, but I also have, that we all have demons, and it's like I'm kind of feel like me opening up about it and talking about it on my show, I hope that other people who are struggling can relate to that and kind of give them a little bit of hope that, like, hey man, like, you're not in it alone. Like, it's doable. You can get out of that hole. Like, it sucks to be in it and it's horrible, but it's not the end. And there's definitely there's opportunities and help out there to get you through it, and you don't have to do it alone. And my show quickly morphed into me just like embracing people and loving them. And I really truly believe that our community, it's so special, and there's so many people that not only love their animals and are very passionate about it, but at the same time, the love that I've received from people that I just met on the show, doing my show, it was overwhelming. People were so supportive of me, and honestly, it was probably one of the coolest, most like fun things I've genuinely ever have done. And I constantly think to myself, like, how much in this year and a half, I'm a little bit over a year and a half sober now, like, my life has changed, and so much of that was because of the podcast.
That's awesome. So you're saying your podcast is what really plugged you into community?
For sure, 100%.
Yeah, that's sort of what I have in mind with starting this amphibian podcast, Frogcast. You and I are old enough. We were born before everyone was online, and we've seen the multiple iterations of online community, social media, and whatnot. And I've found a little bit of the reason why I'm starting this podcast is I've found connection and community has been lacking, despite the fact that a lot of people who are keeping amphibians in captivity, they're online in one way, shape, or form, but the community is not the same. When I first got into the hobby of dart frog keeping in 2004, the place to go were forums. And so I hopped on to Dendroboard, and for maybe almost 10 years, that's the only place I connected with other frog keepers on the internet. And it seemed like it was really active back then. Do you remember, were you involved, whether it was amphibians, reptiles, or something else, were you on forums back in the day?
Oh yeah, it was so cool when the internet exploded and it became accessible. I grew up in a very not financially successful home, we'll say, so money was very tight. But when we finally got a computer and we finally got the internet, it was insane. I remember when you were a kid, do you remember going to the library and fighting through card catalogs and
Yes.
just writing down numbers with those goofy little pencils that are quarter inch or whatever, or not quarter inch, 2-3 inches, and it's going from that to just having what were some of the old search engines Ask Jeeves and Yahoo, and it was and it was wild because you could just put in I don't know, whatever dart frog or salamander or Sicilian that you're into, and this whole world is just now all this knowledge is at our fingertips. And then
I remember I would ride my bike to the library quite often in the 90s. There was 5 or 6 reptile and amphibian books, and if you looked at the little card in the back of the history of who checked them out, it was just me over and over and over again.
Same.
But the library got computers with internet before my household did.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember one of the very first things I did on the library computer, I found a care sheet on Jackson's chameleons. And because of the chameleon from the Magic School Bus, I was pretty locked in. I never did end up getting one, but I was pretty locked in. And the internet was the first place where I was like, oh my gosh, people have these. You can get them. People know how to take care of them. Maybe. In 1997. I don't know.
Right, yeah.
So that was pretty cool. I was also, so one of the things I think that has kind of been lost, I think it was around 2013, 14, that the forums for all the hobbies I was involved in, from tuning cars to amphibians, everyone migrated off the forums onto Facebook, into Facebook groups, and that splintered and spread people out. And just the way that these new social media programs put information in front of the user was totally different than, all the stickies and the community notes in forums. And so I've noticed, and now this is going on 15 years, new people come into a hobby, again, whether this is frogs, reptiles, or putting a turbo in your car, new people come into the hobby over and over again, constantly, and they have the same set of questions. And people who have been in the hobby for a while, who know the answers, who have learned the hard way, who have experience, they're sort of burnt out on answering the questions. And so social media becomes just sort of like a place where questions don't get answered at all, or people are a little bit hostile and annoyed, especially at new people. I think we've all seen that happening. So I'm embracing this podcast as a way to build community between myself and my guests, but also all the listeners, and also sort of get information into the hands of interested people in a way that is friendly and positive. So I hope we can do that.
Yeah.
With Frogcast.
Yeah, I think one of the I think one of the biggest struggles that we all have is when the new person comes in to now it's like Facebook groups, but then they'll ask like a question that has been answered 100 times, literally, sometimes even more. And I just would like, with me on my show, in my first episode, I talked a lot about like, you don't have to respond to, if you're going to be negative. We all started in a spot at that point where we were all new at one point. And if you're going to be hostile or negative or jerkish or off-putting, like, just don't respond. You don't have to be the one to be the messiah of that species. Like, you can literally you can step away from it and not respond to it. And I feel like so many like negative experiences happen because people are we all have things going on. Life can be very chaotic for all of us. So it's like, if you're not in a good mindset, like, just don't respond to that person, and that's okay if you don't. And I feel like with me, I had that mentality very much so, where I remember, like, especially when I was active in addiction, like, I wanted to be the butthole that was like, I know everything, and I'm this jerk who wants, almost wanted that persona. And I realized really quick, like, nobody wants to be friends with a butthead. So, like, I don't want to be a mean person. And like, now, when I see a new person, I usually will message, like, if they ask a question, I'll message them privately and just say, like, hey, this is awesome that you're getting into the hobby. Like, this is so much fun, da-da-da-da-da. Here are some suggestions, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And if I don't respond right away, bear with me, or whatever. But I think that if people just kind of have a little bit of self-awareness to know that they're not, like, either they're too busy or whatever, it's like, it's okay to just scroll past it. We don't need to put negative energy out there if you're not going to, I feel like if you're not going to be happy and positive, that's cool. You don't have to always be happy and positive, because that's not realistic. But at that point, just don't interact and just keep moving on. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that too many people want to have that mentality of the old curmudgeon jerk, and it's like, there's enough of those already. We don't need to strive to be that. Let's be the loving uplift. Let's lift everybody up, because the more people that come in, the more attention we get to these animals that we all love and care about. And at the end of the day, the more attention we bring to them is only going to benefit us tenfold. And us being rude or off-putting to new people is only like shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, for sure. Another thing I want to add to that is everyone in the hobby, especially when you're new and really, really excited, like you're building your first terrarium, getting your first frog or something, you're not only reaching out to the community to answer questions in this like completely pragmatic way. You're looking to connect with other people who share your interest. If you're really into car culture, you don't go to Cars and Coffee every weekend because you have a very, very specific technical question about oil drain fittings. You go to Cars and Coffee to hang out with other people who are as geeky and nerdy and into cars, who, if you tell them about the new turbo you put in your Subaru, they actually know, they think that's cool, because like you tell all your other friends and they just roll your eyes at you. Well, welcome to keeping frogs. My goodness.
Yeah.
If you don't care, you don't care. And so you really want to sort of be part of a community of people who are also interested, who are willing to share information with you. And, even I'm so curious about how other people keep amphibians, not because I'm struggling to keep mine alive or something, but I'm just curious, like, hey, what digital timer? I've tried like 5 or 6 different digital timers. Which one do you use? Do you like it? Is it better than mine? Just all the minutia that's related to this hobby. We just want to talk about it with each other. And so a podcast is a long form conversation between frog nerds, amphibian nerds, to have that conversation. When you reached out to me to ask me to come on your show to talk about the bumblebee toads that I bred this year, I had already been sort of thinking about podcasting, and I had all these ideas, and I was messaging some friends of mine saying like, hey, you should start a podcast because I could come on your show and talk about X, Y, and Z, and you should have this person on as a guest. And if we did this regularly, we could have a good round table. And like, I messaged 4 different people to sort of feel out like, hey, you seem like someone who could do this. And no one jumped on. People don't have time or interest or desire. And so I was already sort of like, maybe I should start this. Maybe I should give it a shot. If I have all these ideas, I might as well put it into play. And coming on your podcast was so fun. It was so easy. You were able to answer some questions I had about starting it for myself. So here we are, episode 1 of the Frogcast. But I want to talk to you about the amphibians you keep. So tell me when, you know, we were all probably the chronic bug catching kids and lizard and snake catching kids. I think everyone in this hobby has that in common. When did you keep your first amphibian in captivity?
Man, my very first amphibian was, I had to be like 5 or 6, and it was a common green frog. His name was Kermit because I was very creative at that age. And oh my God, I love that frog. He was so cool. As a kid, I struggled so hard to get these things to eat. So I would catch them. I was very fortunate. I grew up with a creek, you know, in my backyard. So we had all kinds of cool wildlife. And I'd catch a frog and kind of put it in a tank for like a day or 2 days and just kind of watch it and see if I could get it to eat. And things would never eat. I was trying all kinds of different bugs. They never were interested in them. And I don't know what it was about Kermit, but this frog, I caught him the one day, and I was like, I remember going to the library, looking in the card catalog, and seeing a picture of, oh my gosh, it was one of the species of Pac-Man frogs, and it was eating a goldfish, and I'm like, I've never tried feeding him fish before, so I bought a bunch of guppies, threw them in there, got up the next morning, and they were all gone. Cool. And I was so elated, like, I was so happy. I'm like, it was one of the coolest like, going back to that moment as a kid, like, it was such a victory. So I was like, okay, now I don't feel bad about, like, keeping him because, like, I don't even know if it was a boy or a girl. I never heard him call, but, you know, for whatever. I didn't feel bad about keeping him. So I had held on to him for probably about a month and a half. Now, when I was in school, I had a teacher, and she had invited a group of us, and it was really funny because one of the kids that was invited is actually, I'll give him a plug, his name's Brad Gerke with Brad's Bioactive Builds on YouTube. Awesome guy, totally love that dude. And him and I and a group of us went to our old teacher's house, Mrs. Hanson, and I brought Kermit because she had this awesome pond, and she kind of invited, like, the nature nuts, you know, to go to her house, and we all go to her house for, like, a field trip, you know, barbecue, whatever. Yeah. And I brought Kermit, and I let him go in our pond, and it was so cool to get the updates about him, and he made it through winter, and he was back, and it was just such a cool experience, and that frog literally set off this entire life of mine, where it was like, I realized, as you know, it's a typical story, love dinosaurs, and you find out they're all dead, so that's not, you know, doable, so it's like, then you find alligators, crocodiles, and crocodilians and whatnot. And then, like, frogs, toads, and everything I saw, I just fell in love with. Like, I mean, turtles. I remember as a kid when I caught my first painted turtle. Like, that was one of the coolest little, I mean, it was tiny, you know, it was a hatchling, but it was adorable, and it was such a cool little turtle. And then I wanted to learn all of it. I just absolutely loved every herp. It doesn't matter if it's a Sicilian, if it's a common green tree frog or an anole, like all of that stuff. I love it all. It's so cool. Their adaptations, the natural history, the evolution of them, it just fascinates me so much. And I just want to continue to keep learning about it, you know?
That's cool. I remember in kindergarten, the teacher brought in some tadpoles as a classroom pet just for us to watch for a month as they developed into froglets, and then she let them go. And all the kids in the kindergarten classroom sort of like looked at them every day, but I was just glued to them. I was obsessed with them. I loved it. I thought it was so cool. And then in 3rd grade, the science teacher set up a blue plastic wading pool, like a 4-foot blue plastic wading pool. and he kept it full of bullfrog tadpoles that he brought us all out to collect on a field trip, bring them in the classroom, study them, learn about them for a few weeks, and then let them go again. I thought that was so cool, and that set me on the path to amphibians in captivity. The first species I kept was a green tree frog, American green tree frog, that I kept for almost a decade as a kid. That was awesome. So how did your progression with amphibians lead you to fire salamanders? Because that's what you keep now. That's what you're very passionate about. How did you get to fire salamanders?
So after, I got the itch, and then I realized I started a subscription to Reptile Magazine, and I would flip through it, and I would see all these pictures of all these, really cool dart frogs. So I think a lot of us have this phase where, we see a dart frog, it doesn't look real, they're beautiful, they're so bright. I mean, a dart frog, I think, an in situ picture of a dart frog is just one of the coolest looking animals you're ever going to see, especially if in a tropical setup. It's just, in the wild, they're beautiful. So Brian Potter, who's the owner of Chicago Reptile House, he's the owner or whatever of the NARBC shows. So I was very fortunate enough to live, in that neighborhood, whatever. So I remember going to the Chicago Reptile House, and they had these really little, I don't know how many, maybe a gallon. They were real tiny little glass things set up with little froglets on there. And they were Aratus, and they had Leucomelis and Aratus. And I'm a diehard Packer fan, so obviously I was attracted to the green, and then the common Costa Rican Aratus, and then the Leucomelis. So I'm pleading with my mom, begging her to let me try it. And they were really expensive back in the 90s. Now, they're not throwaway animals by no means, but they were, I don't even remember how much they were, but they're these tiny, they're froglets. They're barely bigger than your fingernails. So I eventually got her to cave and let me get some. And man, I went through a bunch of them, because I had no idea what I was doing. Humidity in the Midwest during the summer, it's doable, but you're constantly spraying, and it was a big struggle of mine. But then I remember reading, I think it was a reptile magazine, or it might have been Vivarium, one of those two magazines, but they had talked about using saran wrap to wrap the screen lids, and that was a game changer. And then I didn't lose frogs. It was it was so cool. But then I, as a kid, it's actually a very shameful admission here. I never, up until last year, I'd never seen a wild crawdad, ever. And I always contributed herping to, summertime. So I wasn't out in the creeks and stuff at I think the appropriate time to see them. So I just got obsessed with salamanders, all of them. And then I got this book that had a beautiful picture of a giglii, the Italian, they're kind of commonly referred to as an Italian salamander, Salamandra giglii, or gigoli, I don't know how the pronunciation, but anyways, but it was a female, or I think it was a female, but the way that they had positioned her, there's a bunch of little larvae swimming by her, and that picture, was imprinted in my brain, and I'm like, this is the coolest animal I've ever seen. So I had so many little, I'm a big action figure nut. I loved toys when I was a kid. My mom worked at Toys R Us, so I had so many fire salamander plastic figurines and stuff, and I never seen them in pet stores ever. And I always wanted to try my luck at keeping them, and it got to a point where I kind of never forgot about them, but I got big into geckos and different, all kind, we go down, rabbit holes and stuff. So in my history of keeping, I've kept all kinds of cool stuff. But then as I became an adult and got adult money, I'm like, man, I always wonder, what is a fire salamander hobby? Is there one? Whatever. So I go down, starting to research them, and I find out about the Lacey Act in 2016, and you can't import them anymore. But luckily, there's a breeder in the United States who is very successful with them. So I got in contact with him, and I lost my mind. Literally, I just started, whatever he had available, I was buying, pairs, and 3 or 4 or 5 at a time. And I had so much fun with them because they're, we can get into the care and stuff, further in, but they're not difficult to keep, and they exhibit so cool behaviors. You can cohab them, you can keep them in pairs. You basically can do whatever, like whatever your taste is. If you want to keep one, they do fine by themselves. If you want to keep a group, they can do good in groups. They're such a cool animal. They're so variable. I absolutely can't talk enough about it. I love them. They're the coolest animal I've ever kept.
Awesome. So cool. So you kept dart frogs for quite a while before?
Yeah. Nothing too crazy. It was all, typically it was Aratus and, oh my gosh, what's the other one? Dendrobates tinctorius. I kept a few of those. But I love Ophaga species. Pumilio, I would love to try my luck at them. And now that they seem to be successful, people are having a lot more. That's kind of on my bucket list. I'm gonna once I get more established, like in my life and everything, that's gonna be a vivarium I'm gonna set up. I would love to keep some, like Histrionica, the blue ones. I absolutely love those, but those are a little bit more money than Salt Creek, locality Ophaga Pumilio. So I might try my luck with the Salt Creeks first, and then we'll see though.
It's so cool how far the dart frog hobby has come. I think they're accessible to absolutely anyone, and they're such amazing little creatures. You got like ball python people are now getting obsessed with dendrobates and stuff, and just I think it's feasible if you're willing to do the research and you're a young person. They could be a first pet. Like a dart frog could be a first pet. The information is out there, so available. I remember in high school, so like 1998 probably, I was about to get some leucomelas. I had set up a 25-gallon tank for them, was learning all I could from books and a little bit from the internet, and this was like a multi-month step, and the date for the local New England Reptile Expo was coming up, and I knew I'd be able to find some there. But I figured, before I go buy them, I better learn how to culture fruit flies. So I bought the stuff I needed to culture fruit flies. But keep in mind, 1998, this wasn't like, there weren't kits and there weren't YouTube videos. YouTube didn't exist. You just read in a book, they eat fruit flies. You can culture fruit flies in a jar. So I took glass mason jars and put in the fruit fly media, put in some cardboard or something, put in the fruit flies, used a screen, like pantyhose and an elastic band as the lid, and I cultured fruit flies. And so this glass jar is full of fruit flies. And I'm like, how do you feed these to a frog? So I still don't have the frogs yet. So I'm like, I got this glass jar with millions of fruit flies in it. How am I going to feed these to a frog? And what I thought was, pull off the screen lid, put another glass jar upside down on top, let them all crawl up into that glass jar, and then put that glass jar into the dart frog tank. And so the first day I go to try to do this, now I have like these 2 glass jars, and there's fruit flies everywhere. And then just for the split second it takes me to like take that jar off, put it in the tank, pick up my screen lid, get my elastic band, put it back on, there's now fruit flies all over my arms, all over the carpeted floor in my bedroom. There's fruit flies everywhere. And I thought to myself, at this point, my parents don't even know really what I'm up to. They're generally supportive. We've been buying crickets and mealworms for my tree frog for years, but they're not aware of this fruit fly situation. And I think to myself, I'm like, how do people do this? There's no way I'm going to be able to figure out how to feed fruit flies. And so I completely scrapped the idea, and it was like another 6 or 7 years after college before I got dart frogs. And it was this simple. Someone needed to use a plastic container and tap it. That's all. That was the solution to my problem, but I didn't have anyone to teach me that. And nowadays, you can just buy fruit fly culturing kit and watch a YouTube video, and videos are so helpful because you see the person. How do they hold the like, it's little stuff that you would never ever think of. But when you're brand new, zero experience, it's the little things that matter. They're cultured in a plastic cup. Look, I'm going to tap it before taking off the lid, and now there's not fruit flies all over my carpet. And so, yeah, so that's cool. We live in a totally different world now, which is great.
I remember as a kid, what I would do is I had similar setup with the pantyhose over, but I was using like deli cups, but same thing. And I would just pull the pantyhose off and just like leave like in the enclosure, and just flies would pour out, and then I would just put it, and I'd squish who knows how many, put the pantyhose back on, and then just shake the cup to get them all off. And that's how I did it for years, until I realized, like, wait, I can do this way more effective if I just tap them into, it's like, oh my goodness, duh. Like,
Isn't that
but
funny?
it's pretty, but that's the thing too that I love about podcasting is that you're able to get and ask those questions because like to somebody who's been doing it forever, they don't think about it. It's
Don't
just,
even think.
yeah, that's just what I do. It drives me absolutely crazy is when people will refer when they're talking about ambient humidity and moisture and substrate, and they're like, well, you don't want it too wet, but you also don't want it too dry. And then it's like, then they move past that. I'm like, wait, hold on. What on earth does that look like? Because that definition of not too wet but not too dry is wildly probably different than yours. I live in the Midwest. You might live in, Hawaii or Florida where you're, and it's like, what, can you describe like squeeze the soil, like, or something to give the listener a little bit more because like things like that, we don't, I mean, like we don't think about, when we use terminology that has so much ambiguity behind it, it can be lost on beginners very easily and get overwhelming quite fast.
Yeah, I've noticed talking to I've done a few interviews, even though this will be the first podcast that posts. I've already noticed that in discussing this, trying to think like a beginner, assuming that some of my audience for Frogcast will be beginners, when discussing every single care sheet lists temperature and humidity. It doesn't often discuss ventilation. And those three things are really one thing. Temperature, humidity, and ventilation are really one thing. And while you can buy a little meter, a digital meter that tells you what the temperature and humidity is, what the temperature and humidity is in relation to how much ventilation your setup has is dynamic. And so brand new people need to be taught how to think about and how to experiment with that dynamic so that they can get it down right. Because it's really hard in care sheet format to give the exact setup you need. Because as you mentioned, we all live in different places. Different rooms have different airflow, different relative humidity, different ambient temperatures. And then depending on what you use for a cage or an enclosure, whether it's plastic or glass, how much ventilation it has, how you're choosing to heat it might dry it out or not. Are you misting? Are you keeping a wet substrate? There's a whole thing going on. And so I think it'll be my habit to ask my guests to teach us how they think about temperature, humidity, and ventilation to help people learn for themselves how to think about it. So on that note, let's start learning about your Salamandra setups.
Yeah, for sure. And can I get really, really nerdy here real quick?
Go for it.
Going back to your idea about, or not idea, your statement with the ventilation, humidity, and temperature, it's all kind of one and the same. And I agree 100%. So if we take that a step forward and we actually look at atmospheric dynamics, so a little bit of my background, my undergrad is in meteorology. So when we look at that, okay, so temperature is directly related to air pressure. Relative humidity in itself, right? When we're measuring that, we're essentially what we're measuring is the amount of water vapor that's in the air that, if we're at, let's say, 70% humidity, that means that if we have so much water vapor in this column, right? If we think about it as a tube, okay? So your amount of water vapor that the atmosphere, this tube, let's think about it as a theoretical tube, the amount of water vapor that directly is measured for humidity is directly related to temperature. So the warmer your temperature is, means the more actual water vapor that's present in that column of air. However, relative humidity, though, isn't a measure of the amount of actual water vapor that's in the air. It's a percentage. So when we think about, if we were to look at this as a fraction, okay, so relative humidity, RH, is equal to temperature and, or water vapor over temperature, okay? So if we hold one of those three numbers, if we hold one of those constant, in this case, let's hold water vapor consistent, right? So temperature now is indirectly related to relative humidity, which basically means as your temperature goes down, your relative humidity goes up. So and then you also can look at it with, essentially with water vapor and temperature, where now those also as well, because the warmer the temperature is, if we hold if we hold relative humidity consistent and we raise our temperature, that basically means the more actual water vapor can be in that column of air. We have this idea that like, okay, I want my relative humidity to be 70%, you know, that percentage is very important because if we can essentially forget about what the ambient temperature is as long as that percentage we're achieving it. The problem that happens when people see massive drops in their relative humidity is because of the fact that when your temperature, you know, can either goes up or down, allows or takes away the actual amount of water vapor your air can conceivably hold. So in the Midwest, when I struggle with keeping my humidity up, it's because the air temperature is dropping significantly. So when we're keeping animals, you know, it's such an important concept to understand that all of this stuff is, you know, Rob Stone on the Reptile Fight Club, I love this idea of everything's like a cosmic octopus. So everything is all related in some way, shape, or form. And I love that fact that statement that you said that ventilation, because ventilation is key. Air movement can drop temperature. So if you have a dart frog enclosure that's completely wrapped up and you have no ventilation, you know, your air isn't moving, it's stagnant, but it's also going to be a more consistent temperature. So if you're struggling with keeping your temperature consistent for whatever animal it's keeping, you can adjust, you can tweak things. You can, you know, take away a fan or add more cover, you know, or whatever. So like, that's the stuff with beginners that can get very, very overwhelming. So I say all that, and I say all that because I don't want any beginner to get overwhelmed, but you can have fun with it. You don't need to get stressed out about it. If you develop this sense of community and you're reaching out to people and people are going to be kind and passionate because they understand that we were in a beginning place too, we can give you all kinds of suggestions. And a lot of that stuff you can literally fix like in minutes, you know what I mean? Like, hey, peel your saran wrap back, or go, you know, if you have a glass lid, maybe crack that open a little bit and slap a screen on top, you know, just to allow, you know, things like that. And it doesn't have to get, like, I'm a goofball when it comes to overcomplicating everything. And we can get really complicated if we want, but also talking to a beginner, I have to always stop myself to be like, they don't need to know all that. They just need to know, hey, let me see your lid. Oh, your temperature is way too warm. You don't need to go nuts and put a supplemental, you know, AC into your window. How about we add a little bit of ventilation and maybe add a fan, and you're going to see, you know, because of you know, how atmospheric dynamics work, you're going to lower the temperature in your cage a few degrees, things like that. So I think having an idea, even for a beginner, that honestly everything, you know, calcium intake, supplements to temperature to metabolism, like all of this stuff is all related, and it's really, really fun and fascinating. And if you don't want to get that detailed, you don't have to, but it's really cool and it's really fun to learn how all of this stuff kind of intertwines and reacts. And, you know, one thing, you know, it's like physics, right? You know, with every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. You think about that with your animals. When you do something, it's going to cause something else to change. Yeah. So I don't know. That's what I really nerd out about. I love all that stuff. But anyways, sorry. Side note.
No, you're right. That was awesome. Building an enclosure, building a habitat, not just a physical space, but a habitat with microclimates in it, is part of the appeal to this hobby, to keeping these niche animals, especially some of the ones that are intermediate to expert level care. And that's what people can get really interested in. You're right. A beginner doesn't already need to be an atmospheric scientist to figure out what temperature and humidity to keep their tree frog or fire salamander at. But it goes to show that if you're starting from zero and you get this single piece of paper tri-fold care sheet from the pet store, that might not be enough to help you have success. You need a community of people who have some experience that you can ask questions to, bounce ideas off of, and maybe listening to podcasts like this will stand in for that. If you don't have the direct experience of talking to someone, the conversations we can have on the podcast will stand in for that. Yeah. Okay. So
definitely,
you have fire salamanders. But what is it like to set up a habitat for fire salamanders?
Yeah. So there's 3 ways to approach it. You can do it naturalistic, or I should say 2 ways. You can do it naturalistic, or you can do it what I call, for lack of a better term, sterile. There's success with both ways. I keep my juveniles and my like freshly morphed ones, I keep those sterile, and then I keep my adults and subadults naturalistic. A naturalistic setup for me, what it looks like is I use just organic topsoil. I don't go crazy making like when we think of like ABG mix, you need all this drainage and stuff like that. I find more success with just using just normal topsoil. If you can source it yourself from an area that doesn't have pesticides and fertilizers, that I don't see a problem with. But I just go to like Home Depot and buy like literally a $2, $3 bag of topsoil, that says it's, and it says organic. I take, who knows if it really is, but I haven't had any animals die off because of it. So that's what I use. And I do use false bottoms because one of the tricks with fire salamander, when we think of amphibians, a lot of people's minds go, paludarium, lots of moisture, water, and all this stuff. Fire salamanders, think about them occupying the same ecological niche as like our American toads. So when we find toads in the wild, we're typically not finding them in bodies of water. We usually see them in our gardens, in our backyards. They're away from water sources, and they only return to those typically to breed. And that you can kind of have that idea with fire salamanders, is that they're not going to be hanging out at in a body of water in the wild. They're going to be going to those water typically to deposit larvae. So in captivity, though, the trick is giving them the opportunity, because hydration with all amphibians is key. So we're not simulating rainstorms and things like that. So to alleviate the added pressure of messing with, ambient air humidity, I use like a little bit of a shallow water bowl, but I make sure that it's big enough that the animal from head to tail can completely get itself into that water bowl. And then also, because of the false bottom, if I do fill it and they splash a bunch of water everywhere, it's just going to drain towards the bottom, because fire salamanders can be very susceptible to fungal infection. So allowing them to have an opportunity to hydrate when they need it, but then also dry out when they need it, I think is key. Going back to that idea of microclimates that you had touched on, I feel like it's very important. You'll have a lot more, in my opinion, you're going to have a lot more fun allowing them to let them regulate their hydration needs, instead of keeping them on a wet paper towel and then letting it dry out and spraying it every day and so on and so forth. It's kind of, you're less involved, because fire salamanders aren't they're a looking pet. Think of them as a fish tank. You're not going to be holding them and handling them. So the less you're in the enclosure, hence why I started my podcast, the better, because the more you're messing around in there, the more they're going to be stressed out and get annoyed with you. Like, why is this food monkey in here? Is he feeding me? Oh, he's not. So having that substrate that can drain, it doesn't have, because they're not like taking a bath and splashing water everywhere, but they will get water out of their enclosure, and making sure that soil isn't saturated. And when I mean saturated, like when you look at it, when you look at dry topsoil and wet topsoil, you'll visibly be able to tell the difference. And I feel like having an area that is completely dry and having an area that is damp. And when I mean damp, if you grab it and you squeeze it in your hand and it stays clumped together, like, that's good. If you grab it and you squeeze it and water's dripping out of it, then that's when you got to introduce your false bottom, because then you can get anaerobic bacteria, which basically is bacteria that grows without oxygen. So you don't want to have that in your enclosure, and false bottoms alleviate all of that. It lets water drain out, and you're good to go.
So let me jump in there about just cage size in general. For 50 years, the pet industry has always phrased things in care sheet format. And so if it was writing a care sheet for a fire salamander, it would say something like, you need a 20-gallon tank for 1 or 2 fire salamanders and an additional 10-gallon for each fire salamander after that. And that is not helpful. That information is not helpful, because 10 gallons of what? These aren't aquatic. They're living terrestrial. And so I think I've been writing some care sheets for my website, frograck.com. For any animal I sell, I feel obligated to at least put up a care sheet as a starting point, and then people are definitely welcome to ask me tons of questions once they've read the care sheet. And so I've been trying to figure out a way how to phrase, because that is a question. People need to know, what size enclosure do I need for this particular animal? And So you got to say something. You can't say nothing. Thankfully, we live in a world where 3-foot and 4-foot long footprint terrariums are common and affordable, which is really cool. And so maybe even thinking about fire salamanders, if my question was, what size enclosure do I need for them? The answer might be, you need the size enclosure that you can accomplish a gradient in moisture. And I probably can't do that in a 10-gallon tank. Like, try as I may, there's not enough space to allow there to be a moisture gradient in only 20 by 10 inches. But maybe a bigger enclosure that becomes doable. I can put in a substrate, a false bottom, a substrate divider, use some filter foam to really lift the substrate up off the bottom. You know, so bigger space allows me to accomplish the husbandry that's necessary for the animal. And it has a lot less to do with like, oh, it's only a 6-inch long animal. Why can't I keep it in a 10-gallon tank? It has more to do with how big does the enclosure need to be for you to provide habitat. And oftentimes bigger is better. And I think that's really good that these days you have a lot of options for housing reptiles and amphibians.
Yeah, I think, like, the idea of when people will say, like, you know, is the enclosure too big? Is it going to stress the animal out? I think going back to how it's set up can alleviate all of that. Because if you have, like, people will struggle with, I think it's real common with, like, snakes, where they get a neonate and then it's like the enclosure's too big, it's not eating or whatever. Yep. I think if you give the animal the security that it needs and the temperatures that it's seeking out, and that, you know, can look like a paper towel in a big bin, and then having a hide on the hot spot, a hide on the cold spot, a hide on a hot humid spot, a hide on a cold, you know, humid spot. Like, you give it options, and then for that animal to fully feel like it can achieve whatever it needs, a lot of that stress is going to be alleviated. That being said, though, sometimes it's not realistic, and sometimes it is easier just to have an ambient setup with, like, a baby or something, or a neonate, where it's like, or a fresh metamorphosed frog or something, where you can, as a keeper, we also have to, you know, we're limited to, you know, unfortunately, space. You know, a lot of us don't have massive mansions, you know, but I think that I always lean on the side of the bigger you can go, the better. That makes sense for you to keep the animal healthy. So if you're not going to be able to achieve all these different needs for the animal, I think that going to a little bit of a smaller enclosure to better achieve success health-wise for that animal, that's all, you know, the health of the animal is always priority. So but yeah, with fire salamanders, it's easy. I mean, you can keep them in a, you know, I give my one friend, you know, we used to joke with him all the time because everything was 55 gallon. Put it in 55 gallon because, like, they're huge, they're long, and honestly, fire salamanders will explore. They'll be out at night. You'll see them walking. They'll be all around their enclosure. So fire salamanders are great because I would not recommend keeping them in anything smaller than, you know, just so people can have a better idea of, like, a 20-gallon long fish tank. That is, to me, like, I think for one, I think that I know people keep them in smaller and they have success with it, but the animals are active, they move around, and I feel like giving them more ability to move around so their muscles don't atrophy, you know, just almost, it's like giving them something to do. You don't want to be stuck in a, you know, now they don't think like us, but still, like, them sitting around in a little 10-gallon tank all day, it's like, I don't know, that's kind of boring. Like, you know, like, it's like, give them some stuff, and like you made that good point of elevation, you know, having higher substrate in some areas and lower in others, and making them move up and down a gradient is, like, really important, because again, it goes back to the health of the animal. And in the wild, you know, they're going to be climbing over rocks and logs or going underground, you know, they're going to be moving around. They're not walking on flat stuff all day long. So yeah, making the enclosure look natural as what you would picture a forest in Germany look like I say, go for it, man. Like, go have fun, get as creative as you want.
I love that front opening enclosures are so mainstream, and there's dozens and dozens of options, and you can go buy them at any pet store in America. Because if for no other reason, you know, let's take a 36-inch long front opening glass enclosure and compare it to a 55-gallon aquarium that you've repurposed as a terrarium. if for no other reason than your experience as a keeper, having to get in there and change water bowls and feed the animals and look at the animals and enjoy them, it being able to open the front and interact with them at eye level as opposed to top down, it makes a big difference in how enjoyable it is to interact with the animal and keep the animal. Right now I have some American toads and I have some marbled newts as being kept terrestrial. And for a long time I did have the marbled newts in plastic bins, and so take the lid off the top, drop in food, most of my marble newts are tong fed, and they'll take turtle pellets or chopped earthworms right off of forceps, feeding them top down and wiggling it in front of their face versus opening the front of the enclosure and right at eye level with the animal trying to feed it from tongs is so much cooler and more enjoyable, and it makes me look forward to interacting with the animals on feeding day. And so I really recommend that be where people go to, is front opening enclosures. If you can.
Yeah.
It's not necessary, but it's enjoyable.
Yeah, and then plus, like, it's cool when you have, like, a rack of, like, uniform front opening enclosures. Like, if you're keeping 3 or 4 species of whatever amphibian, you know, and you got all, you know, everything looks nice, and it just, the presentation looks cool, you know,
Yeah.
when you see, like, I'll be the first to admit, like, my fire salamanders, I have them set up in all kinds of different weird enclosures and stuff, but, you know, I would love to just do, I don't know if you've ever seen or watched Troy's Tropical Garage on YouTube. His setups are ridiculous. Like, his whole garage is just, it's so dialed in. It looks so awesome. And that, to me, that's like life goals. Like, that's one thing I would love to just like.
That full of fire salamanders.
Oh my goodness, dude. It would be so sweet. But yeah, that's definitely, you know, it's really, I mean, the front opening enclosures just look super cool. Like, I definitely recommend, if you can get them, you know, if you're able to spend a little bit extra to get a cool Exoterra, Zoomed, or whatever other brands are out there, like, go for that, man. Like, do it, you know.
All right, tell me a little bit more. You told me you're using organic topsoil. My number one question with terrestrial amphibians is related to substrate. Does it stick to their skin? And what would you avoid? What sort of substrates should people avoid putting a fire salamander on?
Cocoa fiber. I think for any amphibian, just throw that stuff out. Like, I don't.
Yep.
That stuff's horrible when it decays. I think it's really high acidic. You know, it's just don't mess with cocoa fiber. That stuff, it kind of looks naturalistic, but you can get organic topsoil way cheaper, and it looks just as natural. And, you know, if you get a little creative, or if you needed to drain better, you can add, you know, like, literally just go buy a bag of, like, rocks and wash them off and put them in there to help alleviate the compaction, you know, or stuff. Or if you want to get fancy, get orchid bark and mix that in your topsoil, and that'll help, you know, with drainage. But yeah, I don't mess with cocoa fiber. That stuff is not, I don't like it. I never use it. It's just goofy. I don't even use it to incubate eggs on. Like, that stuff's goofy. But yeah, good stuff to use is, like, organic topsoil, like sphagnum moss, you know, mix that. If you want to get more involved in the creation of your substrate, you know, I would say, like, sphagnum moss is cool. I love orchid bark. And then topsoil, you can do sand, you know, if you want to mix a little bit of sand. Europeans are real big with loam. It's basically like a clay kind of substrate. That stuff works great. And that, I believe, you can actually propagate moss on. So if you want to take it to the next level and start getting live plants growing in your enclosures, like, loam is really good for, like, I think moss will grow on it really well. But again, going back to, you know, topsoil, like, I have these Australian geckos. They're Celebrosis, the leaf-tailed geckos. And just the other day, I was tweaking one of their enclosures, and I pulled out one of the cork flats, and I have this whole patch of moss. I don't even put moss in there, and it's all grow. I'm like, oh, this is pretty cool. So, like, you know, topsoil, I love it. I think it's the best, you know, and I would recommend that over any other substrate for juveniles or subadults and adults.
Yep.
Yeah, that stuff, it's awesome.
Are your juveniles on paper towels? Is that what you said?
Yeah, so the reason why I do that is it gives me more control over being able to monitor their fecal, because, you know, as they're very voracious eaters, and, you know, they pass a lot of stools. So I feel like some of the stuff that I can control, and as far as monitoring them, because the other thing too is, like what you had said about substrate sticking to them.
Yep.
The adults, I've never had a problem with them, and sometimes they're not mole salamanders, like the marble up here, but they will. I've had them do that where they've gone full blown under in their substrate, and when they come out, they might have some topsoil stuck to them, but for the most part, once it dries, it comes off, and then if it doesn't dry, they'll soak. My fire salamanders, because I don't do a lot of spraying of the substrate, I utilize a water dish, and they'll soak in it, and it all comes right off, and it's never a concern of mine with a lot of substrate being stuck on them. I've heard people err on the side of caution of that, but in my experience of keeping them, I've never had a problem with it. At least I'm aware of, nothing ever be detrimental to their health. So,
do you use leaf litter with your adults or anything?
I try, but then they smash it because they're pretty active, and it gets broke down, and there's isopod. Well, I think there's isopods, and so they ate them all, but there's isopods in there and springtails, so they're the tridivores. They're going to break all that stuff down. But I would try to keep it refreshed, but when you got, what do I have? Probably 12 adult enclosures set up. It's like, you kind of just forget to put more leaf litter in there. But when I remember, I'll throw more in there, and they like it. They'll go underneath it, and they'll walk on top of it and stuff like that. But they are pretty, they're, for a little, they're not tiny, but I mean, they do have weight to them, and they'll break those leaves apart, and then they'll smash them down. And then if you have isopods and a healthy colony in there, they'll break that stuff apart. Yeah. And, in days it'll be gone.
Right. Yeah. You'd be refreshing it once a week. Yeah. And even in nature, leaves only refresh the forest floor once a year, really. All right, so now tell us about temperature, humidity, and ventilation. What are we thinking about when we're trying to keep our fire salamanders happy?
Yeah, so that's the big kicker. So one of the things with fire salamanders is they don't like it hot. And when I mean hot, I don't recommend letting them get above like 73, 74 degrees for more than a couple hours a day. And if they do get that warm, it's really important to get them down to the bare minimal of 68 degrees at night. They can tolerate, when I say tolerate, I literally mean the definition of tolerate, temperatures above 72, 73 degrees. But if when I say keeping them at that temperature, you're going to end up with them perishing. They don't do hot temperatures well at all. Some species within the genus Salamandra can deal with hotter temperatures, but the stuff that's readily available, now I'm just speaking for the United States, the stuff that we have available to us, most of them are not as heat tolerant as some of the other species in the genus. So I say 70 degrees warm, you're good during the day. Get them down to 68 at night. You shouldn't have any issues as long as they can hydrate. And then ventilation is massively important. If you don't have a cat and you don't have any little children that you're worried about getting into their enclosure, these are not extremely athletic animals at all. If you have them in a traditional 20-gallon enclosure and you don't have sticks that they can climb up, and they probably couldn't climb them up anyway, but if you basically, you don't have to keep a lid on. A lot of mine, I don't even have lids on just because I don't have a cat. I don't have children, so I'm not worried about outside interactions. So I would say that if you're comfortable enough to make sure that nothing's going to get in there, I wouldn't even recommend keeping a lid as long as the height, if you're achieving a 12-inch height from the top of the substrate layer to the top of the enclosure, I don't see a need for having a lid. The lid is more to keep them safe from outside stuff than it is. And if you're going to do a lid, the screen lids are perfect because they want to have solid, very good airflow. Because again, fungal infections are very not common. Well, if you keep them wrong, they're common. But if you give them ventilation, you give them a bowl they can soak in and dry out, you'll be golden. And don't let them get too hot. You don't want to cook them.
Yep. Does this apply to fire salamanders? There's a lot of species. I'm thinking more reptiles, but there's a lot of species where you can be you can keep them cold. They can get cold, they can get wet, but they can't get cold and wet. Would you say that's true for fire salamanders?
Yeah, they could.
You're trying to keep them cool.
Sorry, go ahead.
You're trying to keep them cool, but you said you didn't want them soggy. Would cool and soggy result in bacterial infections? Do you think?
I don't think if the substrate's soaking wet, like sopping wet, where you grab it and you squeeze it and water's dripping out of it, that's gonna be detrimental to them. However, if it's like, if they're in their water bowl at night and they splash a bunch of water out, or I've had this happen where these guys decide to get all Incredible Hulk style on me, and they'll literally flip some of their water bowls, they'll flip them over and dump them, and then the water will drain out. I mean, I get them in the winter. I've had mine get down to like 48, 49 degrees, and cool. I've seen them soaking. I've seen them literally soaking in their water bowl at like 51 degrees, and they're fine. They don't,
awesome.
I've never put them in a quote unquote proper brumation. I know that keepers, especially in Europe, will do like a full like seasonal cycle with them with that, but I've never done that myself. I slow down on feeding when temperatures get that cold, but they're out, they're eating. I mean, they don't devour, I might go to 2 crickets a week instead of 4, but they'll eat, and they don't lose weight. They look good. They just, obviously it's cooler, so ectothermic animals are going to naturally just slow down. So they do they chill out, but I mean they're still doing their thing.
Awesome. So food, what do you feed them? What are some good fire salamander foods?
Yeah, so my staple is crickets. I get real creative with gut load. Like right now, we have a hibiscus plant that's full flowering, so I'm pumping the crickets with hibiscus for gut load. I do typical stuff, dandelion greens I get at my local grocery store. Red peppers. Essentially, if you do a quick Google search of gut load vegetables that are safe, you can have fun with that. I do keep earthworms in all their enclosures to help with the compaction of the soil. They will predate on earthworms, but recently, since let me take this back. It's important because we're not offering UVB to fire salamanders. I don't trust right now I don't think there's enough people experimenting with it for me to recommend someone who's not experienced to just throw a UV light on them, because right now how our care is dialed in, I think that there's room to improve where we can implement UVB, but where we're at right now with our understanding of it, I still feel like it's in its infancy, so I wouldn't recommend for a beginner or novice to just throw a UV light on them. So that being said, earthworms are loaded with calcium, but I've been told that Europeans that have fed strictly earthworm diets and their animals would perish way earlier than they should. Captivity, these animals can live 40 plus years. Yeah. And they've had animals die maybe 8 years, and then they x-ray them and they have MVD. And fire salamanders don't really do a good job of showing it until they're pretty much beyond the point of return. So
gotcha. Yeah.
Earthworms, because there's no D3, earthworms I feel like more as a treat, because with my crickets, I can control their supplementation, but with D3. So that's why I go feeding with a cricket staple. But you can do dubia. The problem with dubia is that they'll burrow, because I have, topsoil, they're going to go down in the dirt and they're never going to find them. So right. I recommend, a insect that's going to be out moving around that they can hunt, because they will hunt, and it's the best. It's so much fun to watch these goofballs try to track down prey, because they're like me trying to pretend I'm an athlete. I'm a goofy dude that, I try to pretend I can play basketball and all these sports, but I'm sure if I watched a video of myself, I'd look like a total knucklehead. That's what fire salamanders, they'll try. I'll give them credit. They are really trying to look like these athletic monsters, but they flop off their cork tubes and cork bark, and it's just fun to watch them. They're so goofy, but they will eventually get their prey. If it's out moving around, they'll get it cornered, and they'll be able to, take down whatever it is that you're offering them.
Right on. Mealworms, waxworms, black soldier fly larvae as a supplement or a treat, would that be okay?
Yeah, for sure. It's the problem with mealworms and superworms, for example, is the gut load. I like doing animals, like I love crickets because I can see that you could visit, if you're feeding them, like, for example, carrots or red peppers, you're literally going to see that in their abdomen. Like, you'll see them look red or orange. So, like, I know that cricket's gut loaded and it ate what I gave it. Yep. So that's like why with mealworms, I've tried using different gut loads and stuff, and I don't understand the anatomy enough of a mealworm. Like, I know dubias, like when you gut load them, you have to let them like chill for like what 4 or 5 days. I think I was told, because it takes their digestive tract is so long. So it's like, with a cricket, you feed them maybe a day or two before you're gonna offer them as food, and then it's like you're good to go. With a dubia, you're probably gonna have to space that that gut load time a little bit longer. So, but yeah, black soldier fly larvae are great. Even black soldier flies, if you have a lid, or if you let them, pupate and they turn into their little flies, and you probably, if you catch them and pull their wings off and throw them in there, they'll track those down and eat them no problem.
Cool. Are you using vitamin and D3 every single feeding?
So it's weird. I used to do it every feeding, and I feed like once every about 7 to 10 days. I do about 4 appropriate size crickets for the size of the animal. And I do D3. I use the Arcadia D3, Revitalized D3, I think is the supplement. And I do that now kind of like as I feel like it. There's times when I'm just like, I'm not going to dust them today. They're still gut loaded, and I might just do like a carotenoid dusting on them. I'm a goof when it comes to carotenoids. I love using them with any supplement, and so I might just do carotenoids and then whatever their gut load is, and then maybe 3 times a month they get dusted with D3, and then once they don't, or maybe I'll go two times a month. I just kind of switch it up as needed. So as long as they're getting it enough, and what I mean by enough is there's a stream of it happening maybe every other week or so, I think they should be fine. At least I haven't had, in my experience, I haven't had any MBD with mine doing it that way.
Yep. Cool. Breeding fire salamanders, you've had some success with that. I think that's super important if people aren't aware. Because of laws from 2016, whatever is here in the hobby for all tailed amphibians pretty much is what we have, because globally there's a fungus called B-sal, which is a chytrid fungus. It has affected wild populations, especially in places like Europe. And so North America passed some laws saying absolutely no more imports or exports in or out of the country to protect the native species we have here in America, which is a biodiversity hotspot for salamanders. So while that's sort of regrettable that we can't just import whatever we want to keep as pets in captivity, I'm happy that the amazing species in the wild of North America, as of now, are not suffering from B-sal. So it's really important that if you're a caudate keeper like salamanders, that you make an attempt to breed them. And so I'm happy to see that you've had some success with that. What does it take? Well, maybe tell us a little bit about the natural history of how fire salamanders breed and come about having larvae, and then tell us what sort of cycling or conditions are necessary to have that happen in captivity.
Yeah, for sure. So, in the wild, they're found primarily in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. We don't have in the United States the Middle Eastern fire salamander, Inframoculata. That's not here, so we won't touch base on them, because they're a little bit more trickier. They need something called an estivation period, which essentially is they shut down when it gets too hot, and then they need to be brumated as well. We don't have them here, so we're not going to worry about them. The species that is primarily found in the United States is Salamandra salamandra. That's like your typical European fire salamander. So in the wild, being in Europe, they get warm in the summer and they get cold in the winter. Like I said, I don't do a proper quote-unquote brumation. So in the winter, they get snow, in areas that they're found, and they will do what we would consider a real brumation, where they'll go and hunker down for the winter and then come out when things start to thaw out. I don't do that, and I've had success breeding them. I keep mine in a basement, and basically what'll happen is during the summer, they'll hit 70s, maybe a couple times they'll get 72, 73 degrees for a couple hours, but at night I'm always making sure they get down to 68. During the winter time, the heat vents are closed. I mean, I let the basement get as cold. I don't open windows, but my basement will get down to, the upper 50s, low 50s all the time. And that's, I think for me, my success came because when I first got into keeping them, I had a townhouse without a basement. My ground level in the winter, we got down to 65, And then during the day, it got up to 68, I think is what I had the thermostat set. And I never was able to achieve breeding. However, once I bought my house, had a basement, a proper like in-ground, basement, I started breeding,
Cool.
fairly regularly. So that temperature cycle for me, I think was the key, is that they need to experience like a warm period and then a significantly colder period. And that's going to trigger the female to do her reproductive things, with ovulation and, her developing eggs that the male then is going to seek her out. He's going to fertilize them. And then once that, and it's such a cool behavior. They don't do, when we think of amphibian breeding, we typically think of frogs with amplexus, I think some aquatic newts will go into a proper amplexus, but fire salamanders do this cool little dance where the male will position himself underneath the female. He'll wag his chin back and forth under his head on the bottom of her chin, which essentially is a signal for her that he's going to drop what they call a spermatophore. It's like a pyramid looking, gel capsule that the female, he will position her cloaca over it, and then if she's receptive, she'll pick it up, and that's how the fertilization of her eggs will take place. Now, once the fertilization takes place, anywhere between I've read 2 to 6 months is typically when the larva will develop. The larva is developing inside of her. Yep. And once the larva then is ready to basically hatch, they come out of that gel, when we think of like an amphibian egg, they develop she'll birth fully formed salamander larva. And if people who aren't familiar with them, they kind of, think of an axolotl, but they're teeny tiny, and she'll drop anywhere. I've had as few as 4, and I've had, litters as big as 15, 20. So depending on the size of the female and her maturity and I'm assuming diet goes into a lot of that. If you're checking all those boxes, you'll get anywhere between, I would say, like 4 or 5 to upwards to 20. It wouldn't be uncommon.
Yep. What sex ratios do you keep them at? Well, do you keep the males and females together year round? And then is it important to consider how many males are in a tank, or what do you do?
So my friends, I think I drive them nuts with this because I'm so bad at this. What I'll do is I'll buy a group of whatever species, and I'll buy them as juveniles. I'll raise them to adults, and I don't sex them. I just keep, because I don't consider myself, nor do I ever want to be considered like an actual breeder. Yeah. So like, I enjoy keeping the animal for what it is. So it's like when I get larva, it's like, oh, cool, I must add a male, female. But like, I don't go out of my way to set up like pairs or, a 1 point or a 1.2 or a 2.1 or whatever. I have a group of, for example, a subspecies, Salamandra terrestrius. They kind of call them commonly as the line fire salamander.
Yep.
They basically, along their dorsal, they have almost like full lined, line patterns running down their back. Those ones, I have a group of 6 of them. I've literally never sexed them ever. I have no idea what the sex ratio is, and I get larvae from them. So obviously there's males and females in there, but I decked out that enclosure with all these cool live plants, all these weird like cork tubes that are submerged in soil. I put them in there and they just do their salamander thing. And, if I'm blessed enough to get larvae, awesome. If not, that's cool because I still like keeping them and looking at them anyway. Yep. So, I've never had any issues.
The important thing for anyone to know about is, keeping in breeding season, multiple males aren't going to like fight or be territorial or anything like that.
They will wrestle, and it's pretty funny to watch. And I was told that they could stress each other out. Yep. But because I err on the side of bigger enclosures, I've never had any detriment to the animal when the males do combat. Like I have a species of giggly eye, the Italian fire. That's my favorite ones. Those males will wrestle. I see them during breeding season. They'll literally lock up and wrestle, and they literally are like, when I mean wrestle, they're throwing each other around. They tire pretty easy, and it's funny because they'll tire out pretty easily, and then they just kind of go. There's times when they're literally an hour later, they're both underneath the same cork flat, hanging out together, and then. But then there's times where I feel like as long as they have plenty of room, and when I mean plenty of room, we're talking like, at least 2 feet of space where they can get to, they can easily get away from each other, because once they get pooped, they're not very, they're not the most athletic animal. They're going to tire pretty quickly, and then as long as they're not, I think as long as there's a visual barrier where they're not constantly seeing each other when their, hormones are pumping, they'll just chill out and they'll kind of just relax and calm down. And then, yeah, I've never had any issues because of my enclosure. I attribute that to how big my enclosures are.
Great. Yeah, so if someone's keeping fire salamanders and they've just created excellent husbandry conditions and allowed there to be some seasonal variation, and assuming they have a male and a female, they might one day in spring see some larvae swimming around in their water dish. So then what do you do with them?
Yeah, so when you look in the water bowl and you see the ripples, it's super exciting because you're like, that means there's somebody in there, So what I'll do is I literally just your common fish net, for a hobbyist fish keeper, and I'll scoop them out, and I literally set them up, the larvae, in water, like little Tupperware bowls of water, and I will make sure, it's really important because they will be cannibalistic, so it's important, number one, to have live food present all the time, and live food, not the bloodworm, those blocks, it's got to be moving. And two, if you notice that some are growing and getting a lot bigger than the other ones at first, I try my best to make sure that all of them are the same size, that are kept together. I keep them in groups of 6, and I just constantly, for food, I tried this year to raise some strictly on like baby earthworms and then some on blackworms. And I noticed at first the ones on the baby earthworms grew to like a bigger size quickly, but eventually the ones on blackworms caught up and they all eventually morphed out. They look same size, same health. So I think I'm confident to say that if you're feeding them live blackworms their entire lifespan in the larva state, you won't have any issues. They're going to get all the nutrients they need. And I just constantly keep blackworms in there. And then every 2 days, I don't do any like water, half and half, 30% water change. I literally have another empty water bowl or a bowl. I fill it up with just bottled spring water, scoop them out and dump them right into the new water, and then clean out the old Tupperware, and then just have that on deck. And every 2 days, I'm just doing that, switching them back and forth just to keep the water oxygenated.
Neat. And so you're not using like a sponge filter, you're just changing, you're completely changing their little enclosure every 2 days. Okay.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yep.
Cool. Yep. Live food, super important for them.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I do fancy myself something of a caudate breeder. I think I'm raising I'm raising 500 newt larvae this year.
Nice.
So certainly there's something going on at scale around here. Yeah, keeping water clean, keeping them fed, changing water is a bit of a task. With fire salamanders, you're probably going to be dealing with a much smaller quantity of larvae than you would if you're keeping a newt species. But I've been dealing with cannibalism with the triturus species, like marbled newts and crested newts. And at first, and that's different because like the different Asian newt species I keep and the Middle Eastern newt species I keep, their larvae aren't cannibalistic at all.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, but with the triturus, I have to separate larvae by size every couple weeks. Otherwise, it starts out as they rip each other's legs off, and then you'll see a small runty larva with missing legs, and you're like, oh, man, it's starting. And if you don't start separating them by size, they're just going to cannibalize each other. And then your tank of 30 newt larvae will soon be like 6 very, very big newt larvae.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's natural. It happens in their breeding ponds in nature to some extent. But I think the conditions in captivity, they're in such small spaces, and the presence of live food isn't the same as in a pond where there's live food in front of their face 24/7 nonstop. Whereas in captivity, I am feeding them non-live food as well as live food, and it's not in their face all the time. And so I definitely think cannibalism amongst newt larvae or salamander larvae is something that you got to be aware of in captivity and should do everything you can to avoid it happening. I mean, these animals are in our care, so we got to do what we can to avoid that. Okay, and then just touch it base what your juvenile setup. So once they undergo metamorphosis, they lose their gills, they develop lungs, they look like miniature adults, and they climb out of the water. How do you set them up, and what do you feed them when they're that small?
Yeah, so once their gills kind of turn into almost like nubs is when I'll put them in like their morph bin, where basically their morph bin is legit a piece of cork bark, that I put a rock on top so it doesn't float around, and then I fill the water level up to where they can easily crawl out on it. And once I see them on that cork bark,
Yep.
I'll transition them into their juvenile setup, which is basically like a shoebox. I think they're 6-quart Tupperware bins. Because when they're little, they'll use like they'll be that keep them more humid than more moisture is present than the adults, because they are so small, they dry out fairly quickly. So because of the spraying that I do, I don't know if you've ever seen it like with fire belly newts, they'll basically like kind of turn it almost into like a gecko where they'll climb up the glass because they're using that water to stick to it. So I take the lid and I just get like a knife and I cut a huge hole out, but I make sure there's big enough lip so that they can't go parallel to the ground, they'll just fall, but they'll climb up the sides and then they'll drop down. So good ventilation is key. So yeah, I cut the big hole in there, and then I'm putting them on a paper towel with a piece of cork, and depending on how confident you are with being able to make sure they're not drying out, either I'll implement sphagnum moss, and I'll keep that'll always be damp, so if the paper towel does dry out like during the day or whatever, they can still get moisture in that sphagnum moss. But yeah, I'll just, that's, and I'll keep them, it's same thing, similar sizes, if there's smaller ones, the smaller ones stay together, the bigger ones go whatever. And then when they first morph out, I will keep them on blackworms.
Yeah.
And then I always say, like, when they come out of the water, they don't move like an adult fire salamander. They're still kind of clumsy. They're all clumsy, but they're really like, they're not the most graceful little babies. So I give them blackworms just because it's easier for them to get food into them, and they'll grow pretty quickly. So I'll keep them on blackworms for a couple weeks, and then once I feel confident that they're athletic enough, then I'll transition them to like pinhead or 1/8-inch crickets, and then they're pretty much just getting pumped with crickets every 2 to 3 times a week. I would say I try to do, because the crickets are so small. In my mind, I'm trying my best to do at least 2 crickets per salamander that I have in that bin. And I try not to do more than like 10 babies in a bin. And then once they get, you'll know, because they'll start, as they get bigger, I'll break it out. Instead of 10, it'll be 5. And then once they get to a size where I would be confident and feel comfortable shipping, that's when I transition them into a naturalistic setup with dirt. So that usually happens at that like 6 to 7 month span, where then it's like, okay, I can put them on dirt, and then that's when they're basically kept like all the other adults. They go to once a week feeding, and they're rocking and rolling.
Yep. And this is true for a lot of caudates, but fire salamanders, they grow slow, right? They live in a cool environment. They have a kind of a slow metabolism. It takes a couple years to get to full adult size and sexual maturity. Is that right?
Yeah. I'm aware of one breeder in the United States where she actually got larvae from 2-year-olds. So I think when you're at that 2-year-old mark, depending on the size of your animals and the sex ratios, I think that's when you got to start paying attention basically from the end of fall until, I don't know, maybe the right beginning of summer is when you want to check that water bowl every single day, because you might see ripples and you might have babies in there. I mean, they're not on a schedule. Female's gonna drop when she's ready to drop. So
cool. Blackworms. Let me touch upon blackworms for a little bit. Anytime we talk about caudates and raising larvae, blackworms is gonna come up. And it sounds nice and simple. Yep, just get blackworms and feed it to them. But if you've never done this, it's not always that easy. There are some aquatic focused pet stores that might have live blackworms available, and that would be convenient if you have one nearby. They will be expensive, be forewarned, but that'd be a good way to maybe once a week, once every other week, to go buy blackworms. But I think for most people, and I'm curious what you have to do, are you mail ordering blackworms by the pound?
No, I'm actually lucky because I'm outside of Chicago, so we have a plethora of really good pet stores where I can get blackworms whenever I need them. So I just go to the pet store and just pick them up. And
I live in the middle of the woods, hours away from civilization in New England. So everything gets delivered with FedEx. But so I'll just touch upon it. If you're going down, if you have to mail order blackworms, they're really expensive. and you need to take some pretty significant steps to keep them alive from day to day or week to week. You got to keep them cold, change their water, because when you got a big old clump of like a half a pound of blackworms, they dirty the water really fast. Like they're secreting something that will just make them melt into a disgusting mess. Ask me how I know. So you got to put in some pretty significant effort into changing their water and keeping them cold every single day. Some people put them in the refrigerator. That's not going to fly in my household. I keep them in the basement in an aerated tank where I do a 50% water change every single day with cold 55-degree well water. And that works okay with me. I'm experimenting, and maybe in a year or two, I'll be able to tell the hobby if this works. I've been experimenting with feeding my newt larva fruit fly larva, and I'm not recommending it yet. I mean, so far so good. I'm keeping the animals alive and they're growing, but fruit flies are cultured on potato flakes and powdered sugar for the most part, so that's calories, but that's not nutrition. And I've done what I can to improve the fruit fly media that I'm using, to put in as much different nutrition as I can in powdered form, and add carotenoids and calcium and D3 and a lot of stuff into my fruit fly media so that those fly larvae are as nutritious as I think is possible. But this is my first year experimenting with that. And like I said, I'm growing a control group of newt larvae on mostly fruit fly larvae supplemented with frozen bloodworms and axolotl pellets. And then I have my other group where they're mostly getting blackworms. So we'll see how that pans out, if I can recommend it or not. It was sort of funny how I came about that. I was actually cleaning my crested geckos, and I had left the food dishes in. Well, I have like this, whatever wild strain of fruit fly is around here and sometimes in my house. If I leave a crested gecko food dish in for 3 days, which if I don't take it out when I feed crickets, and then I don't feed them the prepared crested gecko diet again for a few days, like having a old food dish in there for 3 or 4 days is possible. Not recommended. But even 3 or 4 days, there'd be fruit fly larvae in that food dish. So I'm like, oh man, I got to stay on top of this. But one day, one of those little bottle caps of crested gecko food was absolutely teeming with fruit fly larvae. And I thought, oh man, if I just dip that in the water, that's newt food right there for the newt larvae. And then I thought to myself, I've been culturing fruit flies for 25 years. How come I have never tried this before? And I did a little bit of internet searching about feeding dart frogs. I had heard of people, like when you're trying to really put weight on a skinny dart frog, the larvae probably are higher in fat than the fly itself. And so people had talked about this before. It's not a new idea, but they were like trying to take the culture media and put it through a sieve and wash all the media off the larva, and that was messy and difficult and didn't really work very well. So then I just set up some fruit fly cultures with no excelsior or anything else to climb on, just fruit fly media in the plastic container. And once the media is teeming with larvae that are looking to pupate, they all climb the sides. And so every day with a spoon, I can scrape out, right off the sides of the plastic, I can scrape out just fruit fly larvae and feed them to the newts. So that's my little caudate larva rearing experiment that I have going on right now.
Yeah, that's a good pointer, because especially if you're culturing fruit flies anyway, like you can just set up like a caudate larva or metamorphosis, like feeder station, and just scoop out larvae as needed and dump them in there.
You and I both know Jake, who is almost single-handedly keeping the newt hobby alive in North America by being someone who regularly produces multiple species of newt. To be at that scale, I think it's important that a handful of other people sort of hit that scale of producing newts for the hobby. And to be at that scale, if you're solely raising the larva on blackworms, there's no profit. You lose. You won't make any return. By the time you set everything up and just throw hundreds and thousands of dollars worth of blackworms to raise these newts into sellable sized juveniles, then either the price of the newts has to go way up, which no one likes, or you have to find another way. So I'm just trying to find another way to raise really, really healthy, nutritious larvae for less than what it's been costing to raise blackworms, because I think that's what's been holding the hobby back. There's a lot of small hobbyist breeders, and they can manage to raise maybe 30 or 40 of one species of newt, put it out in the hobby, sell out instantly. This is sort of the case with fire salamanders.
Mm-hmm.
But to scale up production, we need a really good food source for the larva. So I'm working on that.
Mm-hmm.
Can I rant about the price of fire salamanders for a minute?
Yeah, go for it. Absolutely.
I think you don't need to tell us what you sell yours for, but the going rate, like if you look on Morph Market right now, there's one listing for fire salamanders, and I think it's a perfectly fair price at $300 each. In the amphibian world, $300 for one animal this is like pinnacle level. This is like really, really expensive stuff. This is like, other than the large obligate feeding dart frogs that are going for $900 each, these fire salamanders are probably one of the most expensive amphibians in captivity, at $250, $300 each. That's the price of a mediocre crested gecko, and there's 1 million crested geckos for sale right now.
I know. Yeah.
And maybe it's because no one's thinking of fire salamanders as an investment animal the way they think of like a top-of-the-line ball python or top-of-the-line crested gecko. Fire salamanders are more like an obscure Australian gecko, which I know that you also keep, because what we have is what we have. There's no more coming in. And what's here is really, really cool. And if you're lucky enough to find someone who's breeding them and has some captive-born fire salamanders available, that's a really, really special thing. And so I think it's very fair that they're fetching top dollar. And so that's my 2 cents on the price tags. Sometimes people complain about it, but they're rare, they're amazing. Just look at them; they're fantastic animals. And so they don't come cheap.
Yeah, I personally think it's kind of, I don't know, I think it's kind of goofy because they have fairly large, litters. They're not hard to take care of.
Yep.
I think the idea of price pointing an animal, that's part of the reason why I don't like the idea of like breeding, because it's like, I mean, I said that stupidly. For me to breed and to consider myself like a breeder, I don't like playing in that world, just because it's like, it's a living animal that I'm keeping in a box. Like, I mean, ethically, I fight with myself with this all the time about, like, am I even being ethical by having a collection? Like, I and stuff like that. So then it's like, I don't ever want someone who's in a position that they love, like, if they're, like, little Matt, I think to myself, when I was a little kid and I was in love with these fire salamanders, and if there's a little man out there who is like so drawn to them and is very passionate about it, and mom and dad are like, you're insane, we're not spending $300 on a salamander, go in your backyard and find one. Like, I gotta be careful how I say this, but like, I don't care about making money on these animals. Like, it's not my intention. I never wanted it to be. I keep them because I think they're awesome and they're fun and I have a great time doing it. But like, the hobby in itself, there's this idea, I feel like, with like fire salamander breeders in general, that it's almost like I'm gonna spend thousands of dollars, acquire all these animals, and then I'm just gonna turn around and sell a bunch and make all this money. But at the end of the day, it's a salamander, and people don't know generally like the history behind them. And as important it is to appreciate the rarity, and because we can't get new genetics in and all that stuff, it's still a salamander. And like, I think that they're not, if you can achieve their temperatures, they're not very difficult to keep at all. I would consider them pretty much like entry-level amphibian keeping, because you're not doing the dart frog stuff where you need to do all this crazy fruit fly culturing, and you got to worry about, humidity and like live plants, and you have to make these crazy built out, like, awesome terrariums. Like, I feel very, like, annoyed that they're as expensive as they are, because of enough people who bred them, if there was more people who were serious about breeding them, there would be lots of them in the United States. The problem is that people get into them for like a year or two, they don't get larvae, and they move on from them, and then, or the animals die because they're keeping them too warm and things like that. And I think if collectively as a community, the fire salamander community in the United States were to all like really focus, lock down, and really become effective at breeding, and we were doing it regularly all the time, I don't see that price point being stable at all. I think the problem is that not enough people are breeding them, and when they do breed them, this idea of them being so rare and so this and that, where it's like, I mean, I don't know. I know a lot of people who have them now, and I see a lot of people trying to sell them for this really high price, and I just kind of, to myself, I'm like it's so, because they're so cool, and I want everybody who wants a chance to have them, because if the price point is it's keeping a really passionate, successful person from potentially achieving success with working with them, man, I want to get my animals to that person, because if I know they're going to love and cherish them as much and treat them as a privilege to work with them, then man, like, you know, it's I want you to have, you know, that's the person I want to have my animals. I don't want it to just go to a Tinley Park show and have them on my table and put $600 on my erythristic ones, and then some guy or girl is going to buy them and I'm never going to see them or hear from them again, and they're probably going to kill them in a year anyway, you know?
Yeah, that's a shame. I mean, it's fascinating to think about the ethics of commodifying living animals, which is something humans do and have done and will continue to do from whenever we domesticated chickens. We probably started commodifying animals, you know.
You're right.
A price tag was assigned to their value. Yeah, but certainly the rarity factor is still there, despite the fact that they're easy to care for, and there's probably should be some more success with captive breeding, making more available each year. It just, to my observation, it just hasn't really happened. But maybe maybe it's just a supply and demand issue, that there's so much more demand than supply, that whatever supply gets produced gets hovered up pretty quick. Mm-hmm. So it is what it is. If someone really loves the idea of keeping a fire salamander, but availability or price is keeping them back, what other species of salamanders would thrive under the very same conditions as a fire salamander?
I mean, I always tell people, like, you know, fire salamanders in themselves are, a lot of the caudats that I'm aware of that we're keeping in the United States are, a lot of them are aquatic or paludarium setup, and a true terrestrial caudat, you know, the one that's not going to be needed to be kept with like a significant amount of water, are going to be more of your amystoma, you know, your mole salamanders and stuff. The downside with that, though, is that you're never going to see them. You know, I mean, I had a buddy of mine who actually captive bred, you know, marble salamanders, and he had a bunch of babies. He did a really good job. He legitimately captive bred. He cycled them correctly to simulate a dry season, a wet season, all that stuff. Gets all these babies and whatnot. It was really cool, but I'm like, I didn't want to like have them, because like they're literally mole sail. They're going to be underground all the time. So it's like, it's hard to say like, get this one or that one, because the terrestrial ones, if you don't want water like me, I don't want to deal with water changes. I was always, as a kid, I was a terrible fish tank person. So it's like, I don't know really off the top of my head a species that could scratch that itch. Now, if you want something that's similar but might not be a tailed amphibian, you know, toads are great. You know, they're not, you know, if you like an American toad, I mean, they have the cool parotoid glands. You know, their eyes kind of, you know, sit on top of their head like a fire salamander. They don't have the striking colors, but them themselves are a beautiful animal. They're, you know, they're really cool. I think toads are a great outlet if you can't, for whatever price point or whatever reason it is that you can't get into fire salamanders. I tend to try to convince people there's so many cool toad species out there. Like, true toads are freaking awesome, man. They're so cool, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I really enjoy keeping American toads. I'm going to have a podcast guest coming on who is very passionate about producing captive bred American toads. So that's nice. A great option. I'm glad you mentioned that. I don't know. Yeah, the ambistomids, that's a thing. Tiger salamanders, spotted salamanders, marbled salamanders are really cool, beautiful animals that can thrive in captivity. But you're right, they want to literally be buried in deep substrate. You probably have to like dig them up just to feed them, or just let them hunt earthworms and crickets in their enclosure as they see fit. And so they don't make for as enjoyable of a captive animal to have, but their care would probably be the same as a fire salamander. I would recommend the two species that I think are really primed for enjoyable terrestrial setups are the emperor newts Tylotetriton shanjing. They're terrestrial. They can tolerate temperatures up to like 78 degrees, and they like to hide under like a cork bark flat or something, but they are not burrowing. They're not a burrowing species. And then similarly, the marbled newts, the green with the orange stripe, Triterus marmoratus, marbled newts, I keep those and breed those. They make for great terrestrial setup amphibians. Both of those species I know can become very tame and be fed right from tongs. So can fire salamanders if you take the time to tong feed them earthworms or something, or even crickets that are held by the leg. Occasionally tong feeding your pets is mostly something you do more for you as the keeper to enjoy them. That it's not a necessary function of keeping them in captivity. But unfortunately, those two species, the marbled newts and the emperor newts, are also not super common. And as being exotic species, whatever is present here in North America is what we have to work with for genetics and captive breeding and propagating for the hobby. It is what it is. That's why the salamander and newt hobby is sort of a niche within a niche. But it's available if people are really passionate about it.
The one thing with those two species, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like in order to achieve breeding, but they do need to go fully aquatic at some point, right? You need to get them,
to achieve breeding.
Up.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's always my like thing with newts, where like I love them. I think they're beautiful. Marble newts are gorgeous. I would love to have some, but it's like, if I want to watch, my enjoyment of amphibians is watching the entire life cycle, and it's like that whole, it always goes back to water changes and water parameters, and I would like to breed just because I enjoy it, and I would end up just giving them to people, whatever. But it's like, I just kind of like, I don't want to do water, I don't want to have them go into an aquatic stage, because it's like, I mean, can you keep those animals fully terrestrial their entire life if you don't want to breed them? Will they eventually go?
No.
You can. Okay,
yeah,
cool.
Just as a pet. Let's say I have experience with the marbled newts. So in the springtime, if they're experiencing natural cycles of light and temperature, in the springtime, their skin will change to the aquatic condition. It gets a little bit darker. I'm sure, like, at a cellular level, the skin changes so that the animal can live in water and not get like bloated or whatever. And the males develop a crest. But if you and so it's not natural to prevent them from entering the water, because their internal biology is literally changing their bodies to enter into water for a few months to breed. But if you denied them that ability and just left them with the water bowl, they would sort of like get through that phase without really any detriment that I'm aware of, and then just stay terrestrial. So you could keep them as pets without letting them go into the water. But again, I feel the same way you do. Anything I keep, I want to have it experience all as natural of a lifestyle as it can in nature, So, yep, I hear you on that, avoiding the whole aquarium, polidarium issue. Well, we've been going for a while, but before I let you go, something else you've done with fire salamanders was you did some work with fire salamander GIS data, which you'll have to tell us what that means. You presented just this year at the International Herp Symposium, and were recognized with an award for advancing herpetology, which I heard you say you were not expecting at all. But there we have it. Can you explain to us, this was a passion project, a side project that your mind as a scientist and your ability to crunch numbers and look at data, it just drove you to look at fire salamander GIS data. Can you tell us what you looked at, why you looked at it, and what you presented at IHS?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, that was crazy. I mean, the whole, how that came about was pretty interesting, because I was, a good buddy of mine, more of a mentor, Dr. Zach Loafman, had messaged me, and he's like, hey, I had reached out to IHS, like the actual organization, to find out because I couldn't tell what hotel or where it was actually at, because it was on the website, it was at Iguana Land, but then it wasn't, and blah, blah, blah. So I'm like, okay, where am I booking? Where are we going? Whatever. So then Dr. Loafman messages me, and he's like, hey, do you have a minute to talk? And I'm like, boy, what did I say? I was thinking right away I said something stupid on a podcast. So he's like, I'm like, yeah, I'm at work. Let me, can we talk tonight? He's like, yeah, cool. And all day at work, I'm freaking out. Like, what could I have said that was so dumb, to have the scientist reach out to me to yell at me about whatever it was. And then he's like, are you really going to IHS? I'm like, absolutely. Whatever. I'm totally down. I'm going, blah, blah, blah. And he goes, do you want to give a fire salamander talk? And I'm like, yeah, I don't ever shut up. So of course, yeah, let's do it. So I was asked to do something. So they have their symposium was set up in a way that the last day was kind of centered around hobbyists and keepers. Mm-hmm. So Zach had asked if I wanted to do like a husbandry kind of talk on fire salamanders. I'm like, yeah, cool. Like I could do that, So though, in my day job is I do spatial analytics for a living. So I'm like, what else could I do that would be kind of cool that isn't just the typical, this is how you keep them, so on and so forth. I downloaded from iNaturalist. It's a website or an app if no one uses it. It's really fun. It's basically catalogs data points of all kinds of plants and animals and stuff. It's cool just to waste time. I love the messing around on it. It's really fun. You can learn all kinds of cool stuff where things are located. So iNat has this ability where you can download data files, and because of the nature of my career, I can use that data and put it in a format that people can look at and really, you can start to ask questions and come to conclusions based on spatial attributes that this data, how it comes. So I download this data, and when I downloaded it, it was like literally 40,000 points, and I'm like, this is cool because my day job, I want as much data as I can possibly get. I love huge data sets. That's what I do. So I'm like, this is awesome. This isn't like a few points. So I was initially going to do something where I wanted to maybe incorporate like you could probably, I never actually ended up going this route, but I wanted to see if you could see the population of the locations being tagged throughout the course of the years that we have data available to see the impact of bee sales spatially. But that's not what I was asked to present on. I was asked to present on husbandry stuff. So I'm like, what can I do with this data that I could tie it to my keeping? So I've struggled to breed Salamandra gigglia. I've never done it. So I'm like, well, I'm just curious, like where they're found, whatever. So I do this query. Basically, I filter out all the data to where it's only this subspecies. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. There's these areas that they're being found in, but it's not like this continuous area, they're fragmented. So I'm like, well, number one, there could be population, urban, development that's causing these fragmentations of the population. There could be mountain range. There could be a whole bunch of stuff. So I started with GIS. So GIS is a geographical information system. Mm-hmm. Essentially what that means is it's a database that can be displayed visually. So I downloaded all of this spatial data that showed like topography, which essentially is like elevation.
Yep.
And then I downloaded like urban population centers and stuff like that. And then I took it a step forward because of my undergrad being in meteorology. I'm like, well, let me look at the climate data in this area. Bring all this data in. And GIS allows the user to basically stack stuff on top of each other, and then you can start to make correlations between your data. So I bring in this climate data, and then I bring in, the giggly. And when I started analyzing it, the one thing that jumped out at me was the fact that all of the areas that they're being found, climate is saying that they achieve at the average temperature is at least 71 degrees, which is not what my animals are typically being kept at, or at least giggly especially. So I started to wonder, like, am I keeping these even correctly to achieve breeding? Because the Europeans that have success keeping them, the few that I've talked to that have bred them were basically keeping them like in their house. So they're achieving the natural temperature swings in Europe. So I'm assuming that they're probably getting a little bit warmer than what I would personally be comfortable letting mine get to. So I proposed the question in my presentation when I brought all this data together, like, I think the reason why, and part of the reason why I got so obsessed with carotenoids was because I thought I was missing something in their diet. And that is where my mind went right away. But then when I saw all this spatial data being brought together, it was blatantly clear to me that I'm not getting them warm enough in the summer. So I basically put all that together in my presentation and, presented that I don't think the reason why I'm having success is because I'm not literally not letting the males or the females get warm enough to properly do their reproductive cycle. So I've been toying with that this summer because I had done this when I started preparing the data. The presentation was given in June, but I started looking at data. I don't know. I was bad at whatever. I'll admit it. I waited till like 2 weeks before the presentation to even get into this. So I'm like, it's beginning of June, and I'm like, well, it's warm now. Let me let these guys get a little bit hotter. So I've been doing that all summer. So we'll see what we'll see what happens this winter. But I presented that, and it was weird because I was like, it was really funny because I'm sitting at this table with like Billy, awesome dude. I love Billy. He's a great guy. He was on my show. He's been on Reptile Fight Club. He's awesome. So Billy and I, Mike with Slithering Salamander, awesome dude as well. Like we're all sitting together, and we're all talking, and there's this father and son, and we're all yapping, and they're announcing like, these awards or whatever. So all I hear is Fire Salamander, and I literally was like, my mind went right away to like, are you kidding me? Like, there's a legit Fire Salamander scientist here who nobody bothered. This is the end of the conference. I'm like, no one bothered to introduce me to him. Like, are you or her? I'm like, what is going on? Then I hear him say my name, and I'm like, wait, what? Like, I'm just like a goofy keeper that keeps Fire Salamanders in his basement. But apparently everybody appreciated all that work that I put into it, and I got some recognition for it, and it was really special to me because I'm obviously very passionate about our community and these animals, and it was really such a cool honor now to be able to say that, my peers, in academia acknowledge the fact that, like, they appreciated that effort that I put in, and it meant the world to me. So yeah, that was basically my presentation in a nutshell. The beginning part was what we covered, all the keeping and stuff like that. That's why I make the joke. I don't know if this is going to be a video or whatever, but my name, I put Master Overlord Salamandra. I'm by no means an expert. I just do it to be goofy. But yeah, no, it was just funny. It was just such a like crazy thing that happened that I was so honored, and I still am like, why on earth did they, like, there's so many other scientists there that gave, my opinion, way more impressive stuff than I did, but hey, you know what, I didn't make that decision, so it was cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. It seemed so simple to you because you're familiar with looking at data that way. For a lot of the rest of us, that's really impressive because we don't know how to go about doing that, consolidating and examining and overlaying data the way that you did to answer a question that we might have about husbandry or animals in the wild. So that's super cool. I appreciate what you did as well, even though, like I said, it seems simple to you, but I'm glad you got recognized for it because it's not. It also is really exciting because in the world of herpetology in general, in the world of amphibians in the wild and amphibians in captivity, there's still so much to learn that we don't know, that science hasn't nailed down. And so if you are the sort of person who's just super curious, or if you are an amateur scientist or amateur naturalist, the world of amphibians is rich with things waiting to be discovered. There's the chytrid crisis going on globally with both caudates and anurans, and there's so much pioneering that needs to be done with amphibians in captivity to learn why a couple degrees for Salamandra giglioli makes a difference for breeding. Like, that's a fascinating little detail. So it's cool. There's things that hobbyists like us can really contribute to science. So that's fun. That's exciting. Awesome. Well, thanks, Matt, for having this conversation with me today to kick off Frogcast. There's gonna be many more.
Honor.
Awesome.
It's so cool.
Thanks.
When you had reached out and said you were interested in doing it, I was like, man, whatever you need, whatever questions, if I can answer them. If not, I'll find someone who can, because we need more people like this in the podcasting realm, because it is like we have such a bad inconsistency, including myself. I jokingly went into estivation for my podcast for the last few weeks because I had a bunch of travel and stuff. So but it's so great. The more we can get out there is awesome. And like, Joe, you are such a passionate dude. I was so happy to connect with you because this has been so much fun, and I could not be more happy to be your first guest. This means a lot to me too. So this is awesome, man.
Awesome.
I cannot wait to listen to all these
Matt.
shows.
Reminder to listeners, if you don't already know, you should be listening to Not Another Reptile Podcast. And where else should people look for you on the internet?
Pretty much just my Instagram. I'm terrible with social media. Like, I love being on it and interacting with people, but I don't post a lot on it at all. But you can always DM me, like, Not Another Reptile Podcast on IG. Just shoot me a message. I respond. If I don't respond to you right away, I will get to it. I do have a day job, so, like, that's during the week, during the day, it kind of eats up a lot of, obviously, my time. But, yeah, I will get back. I get back to everybody. So, yeah, shoot me a message if you want to BS about salamanders. I keep a lot of geckos. I have snakes. I love it all. Like turtles, whatever. If it's cold-blooded and has a backbone, I will be more than happy to talk about it.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for everyone for listening. See you next time. There you have it. Episode 1 of the Frog Rack podcast. If you made it this far, you are officially a fellow amphibian freak, so give this podcast a like and a follow and share it with a friend. If you would like to connect with me, find Frog Rack on Facebook or Instagram. Listen to more podcast episodes on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Message me with ideas for guests and topics that you would like covered in future episodes of the Frog Rack podcast. I really hope that this podcast is driven by you guys, the amphibian community. So stay tuned for future episodes with other fantastic guests. Thanks for listening.